Concavenator was a medium-sized theropod dinosaur, which is notable for multiple reasons. It had a very unusual hump on its back, whose purpose is still unknown. Concavenator is also known from a nearly complete skeleton, which is one of the best preserved skeletons that has been found belonging to its branch of theropoda, Carcharodontosauridae. The skeleton also has preserved impressions of Concavenator's scales, as well as possible evidence of feathers. Concavenator was first described in 2010. The holotype skeleton was found in the La Huérguina Formation in the Spanish province of Cuenca. Concavenator's full scientific name, Concavenator corcovadus, means humped Cuenca hunter, Conca being the Roman name for Cuenca. During Concavenator's time, Cuenca was subtropical with a cold wet season and a warmer dry season. This was between 130 to 125 million years ago, during the early Cretaceous. Concavenator's branch of theropoda, Carcharodontosauridae, was closely related to the famous allosaurs of the late Jurassic, and they were the top predators for the first half of the Cretaceous period. The Carcharodontosaurids included some of the largest terrestrial predators to ever evolve, such as Tyrannotitan and Giganotosaurus. Concavenator was a basal Carcharodontosaurid, and nowhere near the size of its titanic cousins. It was only about 6 meters long, and an average human would have been about as tall as its hips, not counting the hump. Still, compared to modern predators, Concavenator would have been massive. In most regards, the Cuenca hunter looked like a smaller, less bulky version of the mega Carcharodontosaurids. It had small ridges above its eyes, which were likely used to attract mates. The back half of Concavenator's lower jaw was curved and jutted out, while the front half was fairly straight. The proper head shape was only recognized several years after it was found, so it is underemphasized in older Concavenator reconstructions. Its head was also proportionally smaller than most other Carcharodontosaurids. While Concavenator's arms are not particularly long, they are also notably longer than those of the larger Carcharodontosaurids. This is because as their heads grew in size, Carcharodontosaurid arms shrank to prevent the front half of the animal from becoming unbalanced. The arms of the Carcharodontosaurid Meraxes ended up about the same proportional size as the famously small arms of the Tyrannosaurids. As for Concavenator's famous hump, it was formed by the two vertebrae in front of the hips, whose neural spines were incredibly long. The vertebrae at the base of its tail were also taller than those of most theropods, so soft tissue may have connected them to the hump. Concavenator's back vertebrae were fairly stiff, which likely evolved to support the hump. At least one theropod had a similar hump, the fragmentary and enigmatic Altispinax. While its exact place in theropoda is uncertain, it is possible Altispinax was a close relative of Concavenator. Another Carcharodontosaurid, Acrocanthosaurus, also had enlarged neural spines. These covered its entire back along with much of its neck and tail. While once reconstructed as a smaller version of a Spinosaurus-like sail, Acrocanthosaurus's neural spines are now thought to have served as muscle attachment points. Given how restricted Concavenator's enlarged neural spines were, this is an unlikely explanation for its hump. The go-to explanation for similar structures in extinct animals, like Stegosaurus and the early stem mammal Dimetrodon, has been that they were thermoregulatory devices. The idea is that they could have been pointed towards the sun to heat up. However, this hypothesis has fallen out of favor in recent years, especially for endothermic animals like dinosaurs. A somewhat more likely version of the old thermoregulatory hypothesis is that Concavenator's hump was used to shed excess heat by increasing its body surface area, much like the ears of African elephants. If soft tissue connected the hump to the tail, this would have been even more effective. The problem with the hypothesis is that other Carcharodontosaurids lacked a comparable hump or sail in spite of the fact that their greater size would have made them even more vulnerable to overheating. Another possibility is that Concavenator used its hump to store fat or other nutrients. This would have fitted its native environment, since the seasonality of prehistoric Spain would have likely impacted how plentiful prey were throughout the year, especially if some of them migrated during the dry season. Finally, much like its eye ridges, Concavenator's hump could have been used for social signaling, such as to attract mates, or for other forms of communication. This is the most common explanation for many strange and showy features in other dinosaurs, and is their most common function among their modern representatives. If this was also the case for Concavenator's hump, it was likely brightly colored in life. Of course, the truth may be that the Cuenca hunter's hump was used for more than a single purpose. While the function of Concavenator's iconic hump is still under debate, its most controversial feature is on its arms. Small bumps have been found on them, which have been hypothesized to be quill knobs. Quill knobs are where ligaments attach feathers to the bone in areas that experience high stress, like wings. Quill knobs have been found in other non-avian dinosaurs like Velociraptor. While the wings created by these feathers were critical in birds' evolving flight, these wings first evolved as elaborate display structures. It is therefore held by some scientists that Concavenator may have also had large feathers on its arms used for a similar purpose. Not all paleontologists agree that the bumps on Concavenator's arms are quill knobs. The most prominent alternative hypothesis is that the bumps were attachment points for muscles. However, re-examination of the arms has found that due to distortion during fossilization, the bumps were on the posterior lateral side of the arms, not the anterior lateral side like originally thought. This position makes it unlikely that they could have been left by any of the muscles present in theropod arms. On the other hand, while rare, this is consistent with the placement of quill knobs in some birds. Part of the reason for the skepticism concerning Concavenator's quill knobs is that most dinosaurs with preserved feathers are from the clade Coelurosauria, while Concavenator and the rest of Carcharodontosauridae belong to their sister clade Carnosauria. When Concavenator was discovered, this provided evidence that feathers might have evolved before the first Coelurosaurs. Support for this hypothesis has only increased since then, with the feathered dinosaurs Juravanator and Churumimus now thought to have potentially been juvenile carnosaurs. Additionally, a study of the thermodynamics of the early theropod Coelophysis found that it would have needed the thermal insulation provided by feathers to even survive, despite living in a warmer climate than other Triassic dinosaurs. Furthermore, what seems to be early feathers have been found in both the Ornithischian dinosaurs, Tyaneulon and Culindrodromeus, as well as some of the closest relatives of the dinosaurs, the flying pterosaurs, suggesting feathers were ancestral to the first dinosaurs. Regardless of whether or not Concavenator belonged to a clade that ancestrally had feathers, there are two other areas of concern regarding its supposed quill knobs. First, the earliest Coelurosaurs did not have quill knobs, or even any of the complex pennaceous feathers that quill knobs hold in place. This makes it extremely unlikely they were somehow present in their last common ancestor with the carnosaurs. Second, the bumps on Concavenator are more irregularly spaced than the quill knobs of modern birds. Therefore, assuming the bumps on Concavenator's arms were used to hold large feathers, they were probably the result of convergent evolution, even if the primitive feathers they held were inherited from a common ancestor with the Coelurosaurs. This also means the feathers they held probably looked quite different from those of Concavenator's more bird-like relatives. An example of this in another dinosaur is the Ornithischian Psittacosaurus, who had simple quills on its tail that were also likely used to attract mates. While the simplest explanation is that Concavenator's knobs held similarly large quills, strange and complex feathers that were different from those of birds did evolve in other dinosaurs. While it is still unclear whether or not Concavenator had feathers, the holotype also preserves impressions of scales on its feet and the underside of its tail. The scales on its feet are very similar to those of birds, with small, irregular, polygonal scales on the bottom of its foot and larger, rectangular scutes on the top. Also, like modern birds, these scutes are divided into scutates, which are larger, and scutella, which are smaller. During 2010, Concavenator was the most basal dinosaur with bird-like foot scales. However, the Ornithischian dinosaur Culindrodromeus, who was found in 2014, had similar scales, suggesting that much like feathers, this condition could have been ancestral to the first dinosaurs. The scales on the underside of Concavenator's tail were irregular, with 3 scales per each row on each vertebra. The limited scale impressions on Concavenator's tail do not answer whether the rest of its body was primarily covered in scales or feathers. Although the more derived Carcharodontosaurids were likely too large to have had large feathery coats without overheating, Concavenator was small enough to potentially benefit from the thermal insulation they provided. As for why no traces of feathers were found with the Concavenator holotype, the preserved scale impressions were limited. The Concavenator carcass is not thought to have been buried immediately after it died. Instead, it seems to have been mummified during the dry season before being buried by water and microbial mats upon the arrival of the wet season. Therefore, any feathers would have likely rotted away long before fossilization. Both its hump and possible quill suggest Concavenator was a social theropod. If so, it is possible the Cuenca hunter lived in packs. While only a single Concavenator skeleton has been found, there is more direct evidence for pack hunting in the Carcharodontosauride Mapusaurus. Multiple Mapusaurus skeletons have been found together, and they are hypothesized to have lived together in life. Although the idea of pack hunting among archosaurs is often met with skepticism, Harris's hawks do hunt cooperatively. On the other side of Archosauria, the aggressive semi-terrestrial Cuban crocodile has also been observed working together when hunting. Carcharodontosaurids also lived longer than other similarly sized theropods, with the Meraxes holotype having lived 53 years when it died. In contrast, the oldest Tyrannosaurus rex specimens had only made it to their early 30s by the time they perished. The life expectancy of the tyrant king is typical of animals that regularly fight each other over territory and mates. This suggests Carcharodontosaurids experience less conflict between members of the same species, which supports the idea they were more social. It has been hypothesized that mega-Carcharodontosaurids became pack hunters in response to the gargantuan size of the contemporary sauropods. These sauropods, such as Argentinosaurus and Patagotitan, were among the largest of all time and would have otherwise been safe even from the deadliest theropods. Concavenator's apparent sociality instead suggests Carcharodontosaurids evolved to hunt cooperatively earlier in their evolution, which later allowed them to rise to the top of the food chain. Cooperative hunting would also help explain Concavenator's relatively small size. Medium-sized predators were rare in dinosaur-dominated ecosystems, with the juveniles of the top predators usually filling this niche. If Concavenator lived in packs, the increased success when hunting would have provided it an advantage over the similarly sized but presumably solitary juveniles of the larger carnivores. The environment preserved in the Huérguina Formation was either a marsh or large lake. While the water column would have been lower during the dry season, it doesn't seem to have outright dried up. Because of this, most of the fossils from the site are from aquatic organisms, with Concavenator being one of the few large terrestrial animals who has been found there. Besides Concavenator, teeth from a Spinosaurid and semi-aquatic relatives of crocodilians are also known from the Huérguina Formation. Semi-terrestrial and fully terrestrial crocodilomorphs were also present, including the small Montsegosuchus. Probable prey of Concavenator found at the site are the pterosaur europara, the early Ornithomimosaur pelicanomimus, and the larger iguanodontian Mantellosaurus anthophylensis. Mantellosaurus anthophylensis is also found in the contemporary Archaea de Morea Formation in Spain and the Wessex Formation in Britain. So it is likely many of the other animals found at those sites, including the famous iguanodon, also coexisted with Concavenator. Concavenator is a very important dinosaur. Beyond its unique appearance, the discovery of Concavenator has broad evolutionary implications, ranging from the bird-like scales on its feet, its possible quill knobs, and it providing an excellent example of what the ancestors of the later mega-Carcharodontosaurids looked like. Finally, Concavenator's medium size is also indicative of it holding a rare place in the food chain for an adult carnivorous dinosaur. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something interesting. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to hit the like button and subscribe if you'd like to see more. Finally, be sure to have a great day.